And as it was already mentioned by Joe, the theme of the SOFA 2021 is making agri-food systems more resilient to shocks and stresses. And please note that we talk about agri-food systems in the report. There is the definition, but basically agriculture is more than just production of food. It's also production of other means of income for farmers, like fibers and other types of commodities. So we need to look at the overall production of the agri-food systems. And the COVID-19 pandemic raised concerns about the fragility of the agri-food systems, and it exposed how a shock of global proportions can occur suddenly and spread so rapidly, and how this sector will react to it, and how many livelihoods were at stake because of the situation. So what we are going to do today is I am going to look into the elements of the report, which clarifies the meaning of agri-food systems, resilience, and provides a framework for analyzing it. It proposes a way of measuring the degree of national agri-food system resilience through a suite of indicators for over 90 countries. The indicators are intended to assess national agri-food systems' capacity to absorb the impact of a shock and provide guidance to policymakers on areas for improvement. These indicators are linked to the 4 key functions of the agri-food systems, that is to ensure robust primary production, availability of food, physical access to food, and economic access to food. The report also identifies the main factors underpinning resilience in rural households. It also provides guiding principles for building resilience. Specifically, it emphasized the importance of preparing for disruptions using a system-wide multi-risk, multi-actor, and multi-sectoral approach. This is the first time we look at resilience from a whole agri-food system perspective at different levels and not just at the household level like we traditionally used to do. Agri-food systems are a vast involving the interlinked activities of primary production of both food and non-food products, as I mentioned before, and all the other activities that bring food to consumers' plates. Such vastness makes agri-food systems vulnerable to shocks and stresses of different origins, environmental, economic, or social. However, resilient agri-food systems manage to withstand such shocks. Specifically, resilient agri-food systems sustainability ensure the availability of and access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food for all over time in the face of any disruptions. Agri-food systems resilience focuses on 6 dimensions of food security, but more specifically on stability of access and sustainability to ensure short and long-term food security and nutrition. Now, to be resilient, agri-food systems depend on 5 distinct capabilities or capacities. The first one is preventive, the second one is anticipative, then absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformation capacity. The main focus of this report is on absorptive capacity, the ability to withstand shocks and stress and facilitate the bouncing back. So if the shock happens today, how well we are to absorb that shock. FAO is also working on preventing and anticipative capacity. We are working on 12 indicators of early warning that will have some predictive power, we hope, that will help countries to be preventive and to anticipate. And we are also working together with our partners on how we can accelerate and adapt and transform and increase the resilience to be able to immediately recover from this shock. But today, we are going to focus only on the absorptive capacity of and how resilient are the countries with this absorptive capacity. The report proposes 4 newly developed indicators to measure the absorptive capacity and agri-food systems at the national level. The first is the Primary Production Flexibility Index, the PPFI, which measures the absorptive capacity of a country's primary agricultural sector. The second indicator is the Dietary Sourcing Flexibility Index, the DSFI, which measures the absorptive capacity of food supply. The third measures the resilience of transportation networks, which is essential to ensure for physical access to food. And we saw during COVID-19 how important was this and how important the logistical part was. And the last indicator measured economic access to a healthy diet during times of crisis, building on estimates from the State of Food Security and Nutrition 2021. The first indicator, the Primary Production Flexibility Index, the PPFI, aims to measure the absorptive capacity of a country's primary agricultural sector by looking at 2 aspects. First, the diversity of commodities produced in the country, and second, the diversity of output markets for these commodities, both domestic and international. The premise is that the most diversified is the composition of both production and marketing channels, the easier is to absorb a demand shock by this country. So if we look at this graph, country B has a higher absorptive capacity than country A because it produces a more diverse set of commodities and then sells them on a more diverse set of domestic and international markets. This indicator can help policymakers determine which elements of production and trade add to the absorptive capacity and hence contribute to the resilience of the country's primary production sector. The indicator was estimated for 181 countries. And here we present the results. And countries are placed very differently in the graphic. However, some patterns emerge. Some countries, those in the blue oval, which include China and India, show a very low level of export diversification and often a high dependence on domestic markets. The countries in the green oval, many high-income countries, show a higher degree of export diversification, often combined with a relatively high diversity of domestic production. Many countries, however, those in the purple oval, which are mostly low-income countries, rely essentially on more limited domestic production diversity for their absorptive capacity, with little export diversification and a low reliance on export markets. And these, for example, are many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the food groups that they need are being imported. However, it is important to underline that while high value of the PPFI is positive in terms of ensuring resilience, there is no optimal composition of the portfolio of the PPFI. Clearly, a huge country such as China can hardly be expected to see as a large contribution from export diversification as a small export-oriented country such as the Netherlands. In summary, the PPFI is a useful tool for countries to analyze their specific situation in terms of vulnerability and possible entry points to improve resilience. The second indicator, the Dietary Sourcing Flexibility Index, the DSFI, in a certain sense, turns the previous indicator around. Indeed, it captures the multiplicity of different pathways through which unit of food can be made available to a consumer. So this is availability of food. This diversity of pathways of food supply has three components: the diversity of domestic production for the domestic market or to be exported, the diversity of imports and trade partners, and the diversity of food stocks held from the previous years. Food stocks. Again, country B has a higher absorptive capacity than country A because not only has country B produces a more diverse set of agricultural commodities and holds a more diverse set of food reserves, but it also imports from a more diverse set of countries, which allow them to be able to have different challenges if a shock occurs in any of those countries. The more the options in terms of sourcing food, the higher the absorptive capacity you will have. And here we represent this DSFI index for 153 countries, which are depicted in the graph. The diversity of domestic production and exports is represented on the y-axis, the diversity of imports represented on the x-axis, and the diversity of stocks is represented by the size of the bubble. The diagonal lines, again, sum the import and production diversity. From the graph, we have two main results that we can see. First, countries diversify their products, their food supply in different ways, either through domestic production or relying more on imports or even buffer stocks. The DSFI value depends only to a certain extent on country size or country income. Again, as for the PPFI, a high overall value indicates a high level of absorptive capacity. However, there is no universal optimal composition of the index in terms of the contribution of the different pathways. Rather, the index can be used by countries to analyze and understand their vulnerability and possible entry points to improve resilience. One third indicator measures countries' food transport network resilience. Robust transportation networks are key for ensuring physical access to food local level. Yet, for half of the 90 countries analyzed, the closure of a critical transportation route could increase travel time by 20% or more for food diverted from the disrupted route, potentially affecting food costs for 845 million people. So the impacts could be huge. The effects are more local in some countries than in others, and the share of population potentially affected ranges from 25% in Nigeria to 78% in South Africa. Finally, we also measured economic access to food for 143 countries in 2019, which can be affected by shocks. We found that approximately 1 billion people will be unable to afford healthy diets if their incomes were reduced by 1/3. This adds to the 3 billion people who we already reported in 2021 that cannot afford a healthy diet. The vast majority of the 1 billion people at risk are found in middle-income countries and in low-income countries, where already a large majority cannot afford a healthy diet. And this can be seen in this map where we show the distribution on where in the world these people will live. The continuous functioning of the food supply chains is also essential to ensure a stable and sustainable flow of food for all. Diverse, redundant, and well-connected food supply chains enhance agri-food systems resilience by providing multiple pathways for producing, sourcing, and distributing food. Acknowledging that there are different types of food supply chains around the world, classified as traditional, transitional, and modern, and within them businesses of varying scales, they require each different business strategies and priority action areas that facilitate adjustment during a shock and contribute to resilience. Yet, for almost all types of food supply chains, building resilience will require costly investments and may entail trade-offs with efficiency and with inclusiveness. Mostly large companies with sufficient investment capacities can overcome the trade-offs with efficiency. However, many small and medium agri-food enterprises risk being pushed out of business as they lack these capacities, and the consequent increase in unemployment and loss of livelihood like we saw during COVID-19. So we need to carefully consider these trade-offs so to be able to minimize them, even if they can become or try to turn them into synergies. Also, we look at the household resilience, which is a typical issue that we have done through our RIMA tools. And here we found that access to education, access to basic services, and asset ownership are important strategies at the household level. And interventions are especially key to households comprising mainly women. But again, our goal here was to look at the whole agri-food systems. So let me close with the major conclusions. So 3 guiding principles can help us to build more resilient agri-food systems. Resilience involves preparing for disruptions, particularly those that cannot be anticipated. Entry points include enhancing the resilience of national agri-food systems through ensuring diversify in food sources and output markets, managing connectivity through more robust transportation infrastructure and logistics, allowing for diverse food supply chains and heterogeneous suppliers, and enhancing the resilience capacity of small-scale producers and vulnerable households through improved access to assets, diversified sources of income, and social services. Second, resilience building is a system-wide, multi-risk, multi-actor, and multi-sectoral approach. This requires analyzing of each component of agri-food systems and the specific risks they face. Doing so may require to expand and improve country-level information to better inform policy design and guide investments. Third, broader policy issues have important implications for resilience. First and foremost, guaranteeing access to healthy diets must be a priority. Other important areas are health and education services, policies to promote gender equality, and policies to promote sustainability of agri-food systems through stewardship of the environment. With 8 years to go until 2030, action on each entry point is needed if we are to build resilience and achieve zero hunger. Thank you very much, and back to you, Rob. And let me start by saying that COVID-19 is like an experiment. No? Essentially, we have a huge shock that affects everybody, and we can observe what was going on. Now, the agricultural sector was extremely resilient to COVID-19, and that showed that we have a capacity. What the report is trying to do is trying to focus, as I said, on absorption, no? How it looks at the country level, the situation, and how much it can be absorbed, and that's why we have the 4 indicators. And we are working now on how to recover, no? What will be the indicators that we need to look for the adaptation and transformation. But many of the topics that was mentioned, like the issue of Julian of integration, I think is really important, because when you are more interconnected to the markets, also you are more vulnerable to the shocks, depending on the type of shocks. COVID-19 is a strange type of shock, but if I am worried about price mobility and convergence of prices, then of course, if I am more connected, I could be more vulnerable to that or to any trade issue. So we need to take that into consideration. But of course, as a risk coping strategy, diversification is important, but it has a trade-off and it has a cost. Now, how much diversified is a different issue, and that's something that we need to look. And there is a difference between looking at the aggregate level of the country than looking at the individual economic unit of the household. The second element, which is extremely important, is the issue of vertical and horizontal integration. And I think that's extremely important because it's another way also to cope with these risks. How well are you integrated horizontally, for example, in the case of smallholders, could help to cope the risk between them. But vertical integration also could be very helpful because you can have mechanisms to diversify. Now, one advantage that the large agro-processor have relative to the small one is scope. Capacity of scope, no economies of scope, because they have more options to where to switch. And that's what happened with Mars and the big companies during COVID-19. they immediately were able to close lines of production and move to other lines. And in many cases, they end in a better situation financially than they were before. Smallholders have less capacity to do that. That's economies of scope you don't have there, but you can have bigger economies of scope if you integrate horizontally and vertically. Now, it's also important to understand, and more linked to Tom, that 5 of the calories we consume today have crossed a border. And 1/3 of what we export is a global value chain, meaning that they cross 3 countries. So yes, it's important that local production and smallholder production plays a huge role, and the numbers of farmers is huge. But it's also important to understand that the dynamics that we have in the sector are extremely interlinked, and the mobility is extremely important. And thank you, Daniel, also for your comments. And I think what you mentioned on inclusive governance is extremely important, but very complex at the same time. It's complex because sometimes inclusiveness could imply that we are not in the first best. So this is like a typical externality, no? Because of the huge inequalities and huge asymmetries of information. It's extremely difficult sometimes to be in the optimal or in the Pareto optimal, and we will end in a second or third best, because every agent have a different perception and have a different level of information, which won't allow you to be able to improve in that inclusiveness. So I think inclusiveness has as a precondition the less possible asymmetry of information to be able to integrate decisions, which could be more optimal, which especially is extremely important in the situation that we are living today. Let me, before I move to the last 2 comments, let me talk about one topic, the issue of concentration that was mentioned. I think it's really important to look into this because higher concentration doesn't mean it's government owned, no? It means that it allows you to have some economies of scale, and there are different ways in you can have concentration. You can have horizontal coordination, which doesn't mean ownership, that will allow you to be more concentrated and therefore achieve economies of scale to do certain types of investments. But the issue of redundancy here, we need to think in terms of opportunity cost, no? So in terms of opportunity cost and potential economies of scale, we can assess and try to model what will be the potential benefits, expected benefits of having this redundancy versus not having the redundancy under a world where we are living, which is a world with significant uncertainty, and especially in agriculture. And the complexity of that level of uncertainty has to be taken into consideration how the discount rates will come and the intertemporal allocation. So those elements can be measured, and we can assess how good is to have that redundancy or not in this world, which should change or could change depending on the state of the nature we are. So we need to think a little bit different, I think, in terms of assessing this, and not to think about sunk cost. No? So if today exists 2 or big silos everywhere, that's a sunk cost already. We need to think differently in terms of opportunity cost of new money coming into the game. Now, the point of Julian, what I was referring to is agribusinesses. So if I am Mars, I have economies of scope for sure, because I have different lines of products. And what happened in COVID-19 was that the demand shifted substantially. And also the input side was problematic because of some logistical problems. So in your case, even if you don't have access to inputs, if they are not organic and grassing naturally, then it will be very difficult for you to produce. Agribusinesses have that capacity to switch inputs because of these economies of scope, which allow them to have more resilient and be able to move to different lines of production or to close lines of production and increase intensity of the other. So that's what I was referring. Now, in the small and large farmers, of course, if a large farmer of production of maize and the communication is closed and the port is closed because of COVID-19 lockdown, then that's it. There is not too much of a margin. You have to export hundreds of thousands of tons, so there is not much to do. But I was talking of economies of scope. Now, in terms of the recommendation, and this is linked to what Kevin was doing. One of the things that we tried to avoid in this report was to come up with one average index of all the different components. We still believe that will be a mistake. We don't want to do a country ranking here where I can say country A is worse than country B in the overall 4 different elements. What we wanted here is to try to analyze 4 dimensions of this absorption capacity, which is one of the elements of resilience, and trying to give information to countries on how well they were placed. So in the graphs I show, there are countries which perform better in one indicator and worse in the other indicator. And of course, there is the common pattern that the poorest countries perform badly in all 4 indicators. And that's clearly what we need to figure out a way to change. No? And what we are trying to do is to inform that to the countries so that they can decide how much of the public investment they will do to be able to do that. So that's the way we believe at least the recommendations should go. How we can help countries to improve this portfolio of indicators so that in the overall dimensions of the 4 different dimensions, which measure different things of absorption capacity, they can respond to that. Now, if they do it through the government or through facilitating private sector at different levels of size, that's a different story. And that's where incentives has to be in place, proper information has to be in place to reduce the asymmetry of information that exists today in the world. But also, it's something that institutional design needs to be in place. Because yes, you want to avoid also that at the end of the line, small businesses could be depleted out of the market, and only medium and large businesses, especially large, will control the whole market. Something like similar to what is happening with the food, the small businesses of food. No? Many of them had to close because there was no way for them to subsist unless if they have government support. Now imagine that situation in an economy which is informal, which is most of the developing countries, which have huge levels of informality. So they don't receive support from governments because they are informal. They require working capital. And if the economies are locked down, they cannot use the working capital because they won't be able to move their goods. Now, the rural areas are kind of different because it's very difficult to enforce lockdown in rural areas. But imagining in the linkages of the commodities in the value chains, which are peri-urban, where most of this is happening, if you lock down the peri-urban areas and you lock down these interlinkages, then this capital of work will disappear. And that's a dramatic change because they don't have access to financial markets. And they will move immediately to poverty, and they will go into this vicious circle until they find a way to accumulate again that working capital. And that's what happened in Latin America a lot with COVID-19. That's why the numbers of hunger were skyrocketing, and also the numbers of poverty, because that informal sector was not poor. And because of the shock and especially the duration of the lockdowns, the informal sector depleted their working capital and they move into poverty. So it's a lot of lessons to learn and how governments can change to increase that institutionality that will help also to find alternative solutions to formality, which not necessarily is the absolute formality. For me, formality is a continuum. No? So what elements of that formalization process will be priority for a government so that these businesses can have more access to financial markets and so on, so that they can subsist under this type of shocks. Because at the end of the line, a small farmer, micro entrepreneur of agribusiness is a private sector, it's a business. So we need to find ways in which we can cope with those restrictions that they have today because of the huge levels of informality. Back to you, Rob.